Hey everyone, we've made it week 24. And for this last week, we're going to talk about the French Revolution. And I'm going to break it into two separate videos just because there is so much going on. And I want you to be able to digest everything that's happening. All right, so part one, French Revolution. Over the next 100 years after the Glorious Revolution, Europe experienced war, poverty, disease, and crop shortages. Even France, who was one of the strongest European countries at the time, was suffering greatly. France was bankrupt and needed money to fund these wars. The answer? Taxes, of course. During this time, France was divided into three groups called estates. Estate 1 consisted of the aristocracy. This is a fancy word meaning wealthy, well-to-do, or having high position. Estate 2 consisted of the church, and this is anyone who was in the church or part of the church would be considered estate 2. Estate 3 was basically everyone else, the majority of the population. This was the poor, business class, artists. Basically, if you weren't wealthy and high a position or of the church, you were in this category. The third estate consisted of approximately 27 million people, about 98% of the nation. It included French citizens who did not have noble French titles or were not ordained by the church, a large number of peasants, most of them who worked as feudal tenants or sharecroppers and were required to pay a range of taxes, tithes, and feudal dues. The third estate was also made up of a small percentage of skilled and unskilled urban workers who worked in cities like Paris. They lived under difficult conditions, earning meager salaries despite being pressured by rising food prices. The most valued members of the third estate were the bourgeoisie. They were successful business owners who ranged from the comfortable middle class to extremely wealthy merchants and landowners. In order to pay for these wars and the debt that the nation faced, they had to raise taxes. The only thing is that the only estate that was taxed was the third estate. And while it did make up a majority of the population, it was also a majority of the poor and impoverished, or those who worked hard and didn't make a lot of money. They were taxed for anything and everything. There was a land tax, there was a working tax, there was a property tax, a salt tax, a bread tax, a tax on how many children you had. Basically, if you could be taxed for it, they did it. In 1789, Louis XVI was the King of France, and he was an absolute monarch. He was married to Marie Antoinette, who was known as a big spender, which is not a good thing when your country is facing bankruptcy and many of your citizens are starving. Things got so bad, and Louis XVI really wasn't a good leader during these hard times, that he was forced to call the Estates General. Now, this is something that hadn't been done in over 100 years. The Estates General were representatives from each of the three estates who would gather to pass laws. The problem is each estate would get one vote, even though the third estate made up more than the first two estates combined. When it came to voting, the third estate always lost 2-1 on every decision. For example, let's say they decided to start taxing the first estate. Well, the first estate would say no. The second estate, who enjoyed most of the same privileges of the first estate, said no, and the third estate would lose with their one yes. Or if the second estate should suggest that the third estate start paying more taxes to the church, the first estate would agree, the second estate would agree, and the third estate again would lose with their only no vote. This made the third estate furious because they represented the majority of the population, but basically had no representation. During this calling of the Estates General, the third estate got fed up and decided to instead meet at a local tennis court. They in turn declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent all the French people far better than the Estates General ever had. They even all signed what's called the Tennis Court Oath, stating that they would not disband, they would not split up until they constructed a nation of individual citizens instead of a kingdom of servile subjects, which is kind of how they were all treated. The National Assembly was strongly backed by the French people who were tired of injustice. On July 14th, the people of Paris marched to the Bastille fortress, which contained weapons and was also used as a prison where citizens were often arbitrarily arrested and thrown into jail. The Bastille was looted and prisoners set free. This act officially began the French Revolution. It terrified aristocrats who met and surrendered their positions as feudal lords. Feudalism came to an end in France. The National Assembly, in turn, passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This protected property, secured trial by jury, and guaranteed free speech. They stated, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights." July 14th is still celebrated every year in France as their sort of Independence Day. Another famous uprising that occurred was called the Women's March, and it began with women in the marketplace just being so furious and fed up with the prices of bread and the lack of bread, one of their main staples, and it was just too expensive. So they decided to lead a march through the city of Paris. Well, as they were marching, more and more people started joining in on their march, and they eventually ended up marching all the way to the Palace of Versailles, where the king was, and demanding that he listen to them. The king listened to them, but still they made more and more demands, and eventually it ended with them bringing the royal family from the Palace of Versailles back to Paris so that they could simply keep an eye on this royal family and make sure that they are following through with what they agreed upon. Although the royal family themselves were not harmed on this trek back to Paris, many of their friends and staff were beheaded and their heads put on pikes. The aristocrats began to flee after this march. From this, political parties start to form. On one side, we have the Republicans who want to do away with the monarchy system altogether. And on the other end, the monarchists who want to keep the monarchy in place. Eventually, as revolution spread, monarchy in France was destroyed. King Louis XVI was executed and the first to be killed by the guillotine. Now, I promised you some more guillotine action in part 2, but I'm going to leave you right here with King Louis XVI's head rolling. See you next week.